From Unknown Armies to Delta Green to Puppetland, my guest today has left his mark on the tabletop RPG industry.
Welcome to DiceGeeks.com Tabletop RPG Show. Level up your RPG campaigns by filling yourself with stories and knowledge. Explore topics from archaeology to film history to writing to literature and much, much more. This is DiceGeeks.com Tabletop RPG Show.
Welcome to the show. My name is Matt, and I am your host. This is the show where we learn how to become better game masters and better role players by filling ourselves with stories and knowledge. It is my absolute pleasure to bring you a conversation with some fascinating person each and every week. These insights into history, game design, writing, filmmaking, storytelling are all aimed at helping us when we are sitting at the gaming table. Now, I talk about kind of my idea of this, kind of the idea of filling yourselves with stories. I talk about this in my book called The No Prep Game Master. If you want to go to DiceGeeks.com, you can find the No Prep Game Master there, or it is on DriveThruRPG at an insanely low price. And you can grab that today, and you can learn a little bit more about my thoughts on no prep game mastering, as well as this concept of filling ourselves with stories and knowledge, and how I think that helps us become better role players and better game masters. Now, I have an amazing guest today. It was just an absolute privilege to speak to him, so I'm not going to waste any more time. Here's the interview. My guest today has had a long career in tabletop role-playing games as well as video game design. He is current design director of digital games at Wizards of the Coast. Scott Tynes. John, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Matt. Glad to be here.
Let's just start off. How were you introduced to tabletop role-playing games?
That would be... I should step back slightly. So I first got introduced to tabletop strategy games, war games, because my dad was a war game player back in the 70s. And one year he and a friend of his who knew some people at SPI, which is one of the war game publishers in the day, my dad and his friend got to go to Gen Con, and they were booth weasels, which is what our industry term calls volunteers who work the booth at a game convention in exchange for free product and a place to sleep. It's a long and proud tradition. And so my dad and his friend were booth weasels for SPI that year at Gen Con. And Dad came home from Gen Con. I was 5 years old or 6 years old, with this stack of war games and adventure games and stuff, all kinds of crazy stuff. And I was fascinated by these hobby games, and I really got into this stuff and played a lot of it with him and with my friends as I got older. So I was kind of primed for this sort of world. Actually, one of those games was a game called Hero that was basically a dungeon crawling sort of tactical game where you're moving chits on a board, but it was definitely a dungeon crawl with spells and stuff, and it was kind of cool. It was fun. So then a friend of mine down the street I met, and he was playing D&D. He was 3 years older than me maybe, and so we began to play, and we played a lot. And it was pretty much just the two of us. Either he would, and we would swap off. He'd be the DM, I'd be the player, or vice versa. So we were playing just a ton of one-on-one games. I didn't really join or have a regular D&D group until probably junior high school, I guess, somewhere in there. But we kicked off with D&D, and then we actually got really into Top Secret, which was TSR's original espionage, kind of Cold War modern role-playing game. And we had a ton of fun playing Top Secret, going all kinds of volcano base raids and espionage stuff and so on, which was great. And then I got into probably in high school, junior high school, maybe it was actually. I got into Chill from Pacesetter, which was an early horror role-playing game that was set either in the 1890s or the 1990s. Kind of go either way. And Chill was a really evocative and colorful game with a lot of great kind of lore to it, and a lot of cool stuff going on. And I really loved the adventures for Chill. I was really into those. So Chill was actually the first horror role-playing game I played, and I was very into Chill for a couple of years. And it really wasn't until college that I began playing Call of Cthulhu. When I went off to school, I went to the games club at the university the first week of classes, basically. And they were just starting up Masks and Nyarlathotep. And I had read Lovecraft extensively and knew his stuff and was a fan, but I hadn't really gotten to do Call of Cthulhu. So I jumped into playing Masks, and I died in the first 5 minutes. So that was awesome. We went to Jackson Elias's apartment and interrupted the cultists. And I was playing like an author or something useless. And I was going to go chase after the cultists, like down the fire escape. And someone's like, "Here, take this," and hands me a double-barreled shotgun. And so I run down the stairs and into the alley, and I fire 2 shots. And then I don't have any more shells because it's a double-barrel shotgun. And I was stabbed to death by the Cold and Bloody Tongue. So that was my introduction to Call of Cthulhu. And it's, well, the rest is history, I guess.
And you were hooked from there on, right?
Yeah, exactly.
No, that's fantastic. How then did tabletop role-playing games become your career?
Well, the second year of college, I've been playing Cthulhu, among other things, mostly Cthulhu, though, my whole freshman year. Sophomore year, I got back to school in the fall, and in like September, I think it was, I was reading. I'd been to Gen Con that summer. That was my third Gen Con, I think, that year. My third one in a row. So I'd just been to Gen Con and come back and gone to school, and I had a bunch of new stuff, and I was all excited. And I was reading a magazine interview with the actress Winona Ryder, who at that time had been in Heathers and Beetlejuice and was, making these cool, weird movies. And I'm reading this interview, sitting on campus, and I realized, like, they mentioned, like, she's got a birthday coming up, and I realized, like, oh my God, like she's like 5 months younger than me, and like, what am I doing? Like, I'm sitting in a dorm room, like reading a magazine. This is like, I feel like I'm wasting my time. So I decided then and there that while I was still 19, I would do something to kind of set my life in motion and just like get busy. And so that fall, between then and finals in December, I published the first issue of The Unspeakable Oath, which was my Call of Cthulhu zine that I began doing in college. And so I got that first issue done. It was written and illustrated mostly by, actually entirely by friends of mine in the gaming club. I was lucky enough to be gaming with a really talented artist, Blair Reynolds, and some writers and researchy kind of people who were up for doing some articles. And I wrote a whole bunch of stuff myself, of course. And I got that first issue out at the end of December of 1990, during when I should have been studying for final exams. And then I mailed it off to Chaosium, and I mailed it off to some wholesale distributors who did gaming stuff. And Chaosium called me over winter break and were like, "This is awesome. Like, you should keep doing this. This is great," basically. And then the distributors called and were like, "We want to buy 100 copies of your zine." And so, I got back to school in January, and I had to crank up production and begin like making the copies of the scene and like shipping them out to distributors and doing invoicing and all this. Like, suddenly I was running a business just like out of the blue. And I ran that company for 12 years, all because of Winona Ryder.
How do you feel about self-publishing? I mean, I guess this is probably a very obvious question, but how do you feel about self-publishing now that anybody can, with an internet connection and a somewhat halfway usable device, can publish anything that they want?
I think it's amazing. I mean, back in the day, self-publishing was, a lot more labor intensive and expensive. The early stuff I did at Pagan Publishing, my company, like The Unspeakable Oath and so forth, like I was going to a copy shop and like copying all the pages myself, like at a self-service copier, and then collating them all myself at home, and then folding them and then bringing them back in the copy shop and borrowing their stapler, like their sausage stapler, to staple every copy by hand and then pack them up into boxes and ship them off. Like, that's what that was like. I was trying to save money and make it as cheap as possible to get this thing out the door. So it was a giant pain in the ass, and I'm grateful that's no longer necessary. And these days, I mean, it's so much easier to get stuff out there. A few months ago, I took a look at some of the experimental projects on itch.io. And there's some really, really cool mind-bending kind of little game projects there. tabletop kind of stuff, PDF documents and whatnot, that are really fascinating, really unusual and thought-provoking. And in many cases, they're like 10 pages, like they're just tiny little things. And that would never have been economically viable, like in the wholesale distribution kind of days. Like, why would you buy like a 10-page, photocopied thing for like $1 or something? So this distribution format works great. And actually, like I got to do that kind of style back in 95 because I wrote this game called Puppetland that was just like this experimental little thing I did, kind of a diceless storytelling game that I had no expectation that would be published or would find a home. I mean, I was doing pagan publishing, but I wasn't going to spend our money on this crazy storytelling game I did. So I published it on my website back in 95. I was a pretty early internet adopter because I was in college when the browsers came out and so forth. And so I published Puppetland on my website, and a few months later, I guess, maybe less than a year later, a British games magazine, Arcane, wanted to reprint it in their magazine with some new stuff and new art and so forth, of course. So they picked it up from the website and paid me to reprint it in their magazine. And then James Wallace at Hogshead at the time picked it up and published it as a standalone, role-playing game book. And at around the same time, because of the reprint of that game, the movie rights were purchased to Puppetland. And shockingly enough, by Courtney Solomon, who a year or two later was directing the original D&D movie, which was about as unexpected a journey as I could have expected to go on. And Courtney still owns the rights to Puppetland to this day. He's got the movie rights to it. So I don't think anything's ever going to happen with that. But all of that came about because I self-published this game for free on my website. Just as kind of like hey guys, check it out. Hope you like it. So you never know what's going to happen. And certainly my experience in tabletop gaming was that rather than like trying to get work from other game companies and kind of go like, hey, pick me. If I just did my own thing and I just published my own stuff and did my own work and I did my own networking and met people and people introduced me to other people and I was able to recruit more writers and artists. And as I did, I got to know more people in the industry and then all kinds of opportunities did open up for me. And I was able to do not just my work for my company, but worked for Atlas Games and Steve Jackson Games and Chaosium and other companies over the years. But the first step was really doing good work on my own, putting it out into the world and earning the respect of the gamers, the audience, and my colleagues, and like building up that whole opportunity for myself. So I think self-publishing is a fantastic way to go. And I think that now that it's easier than ever, like by all means, do it.
Just knowing from my experience, right? Just self-publishing, that's what I do. I self-publish all my stuff, and it's just been a fascinating journey to where I've been able to do it now full time, which kind of blows my mind still.
Awesome.
Yeah, it's just unbelievable. So, that was my kind of one of my follow-ups that, now that I've started going to a few conventions and giving some presentations and things, people always ask me, well, how do you break into the industry? And I'm kind of stuck because I'm like, I don't really know the industry that well. I just started self-publishing.
Yeah.
And so I'm glad to hear you kind of say that. But yeah, if somebody's out there and saying, oh, how do I get a job at Wizards of the Coast? What would you tell them to do?
Well, yeah, I mean, just do your own thing. Like if you're, whatever. Now this applies in particular, of course, to like writer, designer-y people because they can make a game or a supplement or whatever and put it out there. Like an adventure or something. If you're an artist, like there's a whole other path about get your portfolio together and submit to art directors at conferences, at conventions or whatever. And I can't really speak to that very well. But certainly, this is my second tour of duty at Wizards of the Coast. They first hired me back in 1994 when I was right out of college. And they hired me because of pagan publishing, because of the work I've been doing. And because I've been self-publishing, they offered me a job as a game designer to move out here and go to work for them. On the strength of the work that I'd published. And so I think it's a fantastic way to go. I should say, like, it isn't even just that you can do it, it's that there's an audience for it. You can go to something like RPG, and even as you've seen, like for my game Unknown Armies, which I created with Greg Stolze, the new edition of Unknown Armies came out a year or two ago, the third edition. And for that, Atlas Games leveraged the drive-through RPG stuff to enable anyone to kind of self-publish their own material for Unknown Armies, for like an official logo and the whole deal, as PDFs on drive-through. And there's many games, of course, that do that now, including D&D with the DM's Guild. And that whole avenue, I think, is just fantastic because there's an audience for it, and they'll spend money to get good content. As a dungeon master for my family, my wife and kid and I play D&D together. I bought a ton of stuff from DM's Guild over the last couple of years, just useful resources like add-ons to campaigns I'm running, that kind of stuff. And it's terrific as a game master. Oh my God, it's such a time savings.
What do you run for your family mostly?
So we've been playing D&D 5th Ed for the last year and a half, I guess. And we play sporadically, we don't have a lot of time to get to it, but we played through a campaign that I created, pulling together kind of adventures from the DM's Guild, in fact, but I stitched them together into a big Forgotten Realms campaign where the elves of the High Forest are trying to find this lost city of Rymanthon in the High Desert, whatever it's called. I can't remember, the High Moor. And Sararak mobilizes a hobgoblin army to assault the High Forest, and they burn the forest to the ground with horrible green lich fire that sucks the souls of the dead and powers up a Sararak. And so in the end, my wife and kid, they found the lost city of Rymanthon, and it became the refuge for the elves to flee to when the High Forest burned up in horrible lich fire. And so they saved the day, but with epic consequences. So it's super fun. And now we're playing Dragon Heist. So we just got that going, and they just have earned their manor house, which is one of the early points in that adventure. So we're having a good time with that. And like our dining room has a giant map of Waterdeep like tacked up on the wall, which we eat beneath every night, which is, that's the kind of family we are.
That's a cool dining room. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, that sounds awesome. I'm also thinking too, just still about your career. You did all this work in tabletop games, but then you've transitioned to video games. Is that correct?
Yeah. So I ran Pagan for 12 years, and I did a tiny bit of video game work kind of on the side, just like some freelance writing for a couple of video game companies. But after 12 years of tabletop, working on Delta Green and Unknown Armies and Puppetland and Sickable Oath and a whole bunch of stuff, I really just burned out. I'd been an entrepreneur for about the whole first phase of my adult life, and doing all the layout and editing and so forth, and working not just by myself, working with my teammates at Pagan, and we were housemates. We were all like living in a house together and running this company. And it was like a frat house for serial killers, as we used to say. And I just burned out. Like I just had done too much for too long. I really needed to change. And so I got into video games, and I've been in video games now for another 17 years, I guess, since then. And that's mostly been what I've done in this phase of my career. I began by I was working on a Delta Green video game that didn't happen, unfortunately, way back when. But that transitioned into an MMO that I did called Pirates of the Burning Sea. It was kind of a big like PvP trading commerce kind of game set in the Caribbean of 1720. And that was a 5-year project, which was great fun. I learned a ton. But at that point, I finished that game and I was ready to make a tiny game. And so I went to Microsoft to work on Xbox Live Arcade. I worked on downloadable digital titles there for a few years. And then got into Kinect, and then did some Kinect stuff there for Microsoft. And then I spent the last 3 years working in virtual reality at a startup in Bellevue, Washington, here near Seattle. And then back in March, I left that place and came back to Wizards after all these years. And so I've been I've been playing video games basically my whole life. As a kid, I got a computer when I was like 10 years old. I learned basic programming, and I wrote a bunch of, arcade games and text adventure games and so forth for my computer. So I was loving doing that stuff as a kid, but I didn't expect to do it as an adult necessarily. I didn't imagine I would, because I really got into the tabletop stuff instead. But coming back into video games and getting into it in a big way has been super fun. And once again, I've gotten to learn a whole lot of new things, which I love to do.
What's the difference between the approach of a tabletop versus a video game when you're talking about designing one?
Well, they're legion, those differences. And it's hard to boil down because any given genre of video game or category of video game has its own differences and different approaches. I'd say that, like, I mean, a thing that I work on a lot is how to find ways for the player to kind of feel like they're in charge of their experience. In tabletop, I did that over the years in Cthulhu stuff, especially by trying to kind of redefine how an investigative adventure worked. When I got into playing Call of Cthulhu, investigative adventures for Cthulhu, mystery adventures, were very much like a linear series of scenes you'd play through that were connected by these breakpoints where you had to make a die roll, like a library use or a spot hidden or something. And if you blew the die roll and missed the clue, then the adventure just dumped you out, and the game master had to kind of figure out how to get you back on track again, essentially. And back in the day, that really felt like the wrong approach. And at Pagan, not just me, but game designers we worked with there, like John Crow and Dennis Detwiller and Scott Glancy and other folks, we really tried to change how to do investigative scenarios and make them more of a sandbox where we could provide, like, here are the antagonists, here's their agenda, here's the timeline they've got, here's locations that are involved, here's witnesses, here's clues, here's stuff you can learn, secrets and so forth. But it's really like the players get to navigate their own way through that sandbox. And we're not trying to prescribe like it's scene A, B, C, D, E. It's more like, here's two big set pieces that get triggered when or if the players do these things or go to these places at the right times. But besides those set pieces, in between is a whole bunch of material that the game master uses improvisationally to kind of like create the story at the table in response to the player's initiative. And that goal of empowering the players to be their own investigators and to kind of like find the way through the mystery themselves was really important to us at Pagan Publishing. And it's hard. It's hard to do that as a game designer. It's hard to do it as a scenario writer. And it's hard to do it as a game master at the table. Like, it's definitely challenging. But we really embraced the challenge of it and the fun of it, because when you were able to make those intuitive leaps or those deductive leaps as a player and realize, like, oh my God, I figured it out. It's this. and then like, we've got to go quick. Come on. We got to get to the thing and do the thing. Like, that was so exciting. The feeling was so great to have that mental connection in your head instead of having a die roll deliver you a clue. So the joy of it was profound, but the challenge was high. And we really worked with that repeatedly across our products to try and solve that in a good way. Gumshoe has done a very different approach, where essentially, like, you get the clue, like you as a game master, you hand the clue to the player more or less. But the players have to like interpret the clue, figure out the clue, like act on the clue, which I totally appreciate. And that does make a lot of sense. And I think what we were trying to do, which Gumshoe is addressing from a different perspective, is really just to empower the players to feel like they are actually the mystery solvers and not just kind of along for the ride.
And that is interesting because, I've been reading Gumshoe recently, and I would like to get to play here eventually. And I was looking into some of your work as well about your kind of approach to the investigative games. And it is interesting because I think, just to kind of reframe the problem for some people, is just, if you're playing, usually if you're playing Dungeons and Dragons or something like this, if you roll investigation and you roll a 4 and everybody at the table rolls a 4, well, you don't get that clue. Well, you're just, all your party is just standing in a room going, well, nothing's happening here.
Right.
And so it is interesting. It's interesting for me now, becoming more involved into, in game design myself, because I can remember sessions especially when I was a teenager or something, where that would happen and my group, like, the game would just break. And I was just like, well, you're not rolling high enough. And my players are upset at me, right? And I'm like, I didn't buy your dice. I'm not rolling. You didn't roll high enough. And then, of course, I have solved that on other occasions by just giving it to them, and I guess that's kind of the approach that Gumshoe takes. But could you maybe just explain a little bit more about your kind of your narrative sandbox idea, just a little bit more in detail?
Yeah, I mean, like the key certainly is that, we wouldn't gate like a specific clue or a crucial clue behind a die roll in our games. Usually what would happen is there'd be some kind of inciting incident that pulls you in, like maybe you get called in to help somebody, a missing persons case, whatever it is. And you start with some kind of initial basket of clues. You've got names and addresses and, information and so forth, and a crime scene to look at, whatever. And the challenge that we found interesting was not, do you spot the clue, but rather, like, if given this basket of information, like, can you, the players at the table, like, piece through it and figure out what are appropriate next actions? Like, you look at the stuff and you're like, okay, we should go talk to this guy and this lady over here, and let's go check out this weird old farmhouse and see what's going on there. And like the players just like derive their own agenda out of the information you present to them. And then each of those things they do, those actions they take, are rewarded because they then get to learn more. And they might ask the wrong questions, or they might overlook some clue in a handout or something, but they have what they need. Like, that's kind of the key, is like they have everything they need as long as they just, like, put the pieces together themselves mentally at the table. And so in a more traditional scenario back in, when I was getting into Cthulhu gaming, that would all be sequenced very specifically. Like, you'd first go talk to this character, then you go investigate the farmhouse, then you go talk to this character, then you go here and you do this. In our sandbox approach, it's more like, okay, here are like the 3 characters you might talk to, and here are 2 locations, and here's a crime scene to check out. And you do it in whatever order you want to. And it's much more organic. And the goal is that you've got plenty of things to work with. It's just up to the players to decide, like, do we go lean on this guy first, or do we try and, like, fast talk our way into this, like, whatever, like Nazi headquarters, whatever it is, or are we going to try this thing instead? And they get to choose not just like what to do next, but how to go about it. And they might show up and try to fast talk somebody or persuade them or go undercover or spy on them, watch them, tail them. Like, there's tons of things they can do, which are familiar tropes from investigative, books and movies and TV shows and so forth. These days, I'm sure they would be like, let's get a DNA sample and that kind of thing, right? But like, that's kind of what we rely on. There's all these conventions of the genre. So players decide what to do and how to do it. And then as a game master, what I'm looking for is, how can I support their agenda? Now that they've decided something, like, you want to reward the players if they have an agenda and they're carrying it out. You want to reward that. Like, that's great. You want them to feel good about taking initiative in a mystery like this. So then I'll just play out the scene with them and ensure that, the scene is going to end up one way or another getting them to the next place they need to go, or the next piece of information they need to have. And if their approach they take, the how, is like terrible or outlandish or stupid, then, like, I might have them like go ahead and just beat their head against a wall for a few minutes. Like, yeah, he's not buying it. He doesn't believe that you're police officers because you're obviously drunken hobos or whatever. Like, I'll go ahead and let them be a little frustrated there, but that just means that they'll regroup and reconsider their tactics and pick a different approach and try something else. And what I want is for the players to get to have that moment of insight and excitement where they realize, like, we've got the thing we need. Now we know what's going on. Now let's go do this. And they give you that feeling. In like caper movies, there's always like the gang of thieves, like at the table with the blueprints for the bank and all the guard schedules and all that kind of stuff, and the van they're going to rent and paint a different color and put the big machine in the back to drill the hole in the vault and all that kind of stuff. And like, they are super, super self-motivated. And like, that's what I want players to be like. I want them to feel like they have that agency and they're empowered to do what they want to do. And then they get to make creative decisions that hopefully work out really well, and we all have a good time. And that's the thing about video games that I've been working with and wrestling with over the years, is how to make the players feel empowered to do what they want to do. And we can't replicate the freedom and creativity you get to have at the table for a role-playing game. Mm-hmm. But when you think about it, you can find ways through it. One of my first projects at Microsoft, when I went to work there on Xbox Live Arcade games, was this was when like Guitar Hero was a big deal the first time around. Mm-hmm. And we were talking at the studio I was in about, all these players have bought these plastic guitars. We should give them something else to do with this plastic guitar besides play Guitar Hero, because it's a controller like any other. You can plug it in and play a game with it. So, and I was thinking about, what other kind of music game could we do? And this project ultimately got canceled, unfortunately. That's how it goes. But what I realized was that when you played a Guitar Hero rock band, the two best Guitar Hero players on the entire planet, when they play the same song, it sounds exactly the same. Like note for note, beat for beat, they're playing exactly the same song, exactly the same way. It sounds exactly the same. And what I wanted to do was, let's find a way to make a guitar game that's improvisational, so that the two amazing players could both play the same track or whatever, the same level or something in this game, but end up with two very different pieces of music. And if we could do that, then that's empowering the player to really have their own agenda and take their own initiative. And that's the first thing I was working on there. And that philosophy of like trying to empower the player has informed everything I've worked on in video games ever since.
I'm just trying to think too, because when I run games, I do a lot of no prep game mastering, and so if I was running an investigation game, I'm thinking I don't necessarily know who committed the murder right at the moment, and so I'm just wondering, like, if you if you're providing them clues, is there then like what you're talking about, there is a set outcome, like you need to follow X clues to get to a set outcome? Because I'm more of the type where I might decide it's a different killer, or something like that, or a different place by the time we get to the end because of the way my players are following clues.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, retaining that flexibility is definitely important as a game master. I would say, I have run purely improvisational adventures like that. I ran one where I just started by, I was taking a lot of photographs in those days, and I just grabbed like 20 random weird photos I'd taken of just different locations with no people in them. And I began to drop those as clues in the adventure. And then the players would be like, "Oh my God, but that's this kind of a place." And I would be like, "Yeah, in fact it is. Let's go there," So you can do that, and it's super fun. Generally, I had a more structured sort of narrative in my head. And so mainly because it was important to me that I knew who the characters were. So who's the antagonist, who's the bad guy, whatever's going on, so that they could have intelligent responses to the players, and they could be having their own agenda, and they could be changing that agenda dynamically in response to what the players do. And so I kind of felt like I needed enough structure to be able to deliver on those characters and their actions. But it's also completely true that like I was very happy to just like change stuff up and replace characters or alter the plot as needed to kind of keep the momentum going. Because what I didn't want, and what happens sometimes in a mystery game, is where the players are just like banging their heads against the wall. And you've got to find a way out of that trap. And being flexible and improvisational as a game master is very important to that. I ran a game once in college. I was running an adventure out of a Chaosium scenario book, and they, for whatever reason, they were investigating a cult. It's like a funeral home with some ghouls and stuff. And somehow the mayor got mentioned. I can't remember how it was. Like there's something about this town, and I said something like, "Oh yeah, well, like there's a big parade tomorrow, and the mayor's doing something or other." And whatever reason, the players just like got the sniff of that and were like, "Hey, I think the mayor's up to something. We should check out the mayor." And so they got suspicious of the mayor, who was not even a character in the adventure. Like it just was something I threw in there.
Yeah. And
so they wanted to go just like drive by the mayor's house and just see like, where does he live? Like in a weird cathedral or something? And and so I never wanted the players to know when I was making something up and when I wasn't. And since I was running an adventure out of the book, this happened quite often. I would just flip to some other adventure elsewhere in the book and find some map that was useful for whatever I needed. And I would just kind of refer to that map for whatever I needed to do. And as far as the players were concerned, they were seeing me like flipping through the book and be like, "Okay, well, it's a 2-story house, blah, blah." And they were like, "It's in the book. We're on the right track." Which is hilarious. And they ended up like, they broke into the mayor's house and they like cast a gate spell and like sacrificed Pow to like be able to sneak back and forth. And this whole like, and just like spiraled into catastrophe. Like it was just a disaster. But it was delightful. Like it was totally, I had a great time running that disaster. And I did not make the mayor the villain because I felt like, I think that, maybe that's rewarding the players for the wrong activity. But they got through it and we had a great time and they got back on track and that was all good.
I do find that I mean, you mentioned about the mayor there mentioning, I find players fixate on things even if I say there's a small rock in the corner of the room or something. It's just something like, I'm trying to describe a road and say, oh, there's a pile of rocks and the road turns to the right. And then you see this giant city down on the horizon. The players will say, I'm checking out that pile of rocks.
Right.
It's like, don't you want to go to the city? No, I'm checking out that pile of rocks. And
yeah,
I think there's something to that, just where people thinking that if it's mentioned by the game master, it's probably important. And
yeah, well, and it's a great point. And I think like it can be really fun for the game master to just like roll with that. Like, take a look at the pile of rocks. Like, okay, absolutely. Sure, you check out the pile of rocks, and inside, and you unstack the pile. And inside, you find the body of a crow with 2 nails driven through its eye sockets. And they'd be like, "What?" And then and like, well, I don't know. I just made that up. But but like now they've got a whole crazy thing they're excited about, and like that's and they're rewarded for taking initiative, which is kind of a fun thing to do.
Yeah, absolutely. And I find too that sometimes they come up during their sessions where they're talking while I'm getting a drink of Mountain Dew or whatever it is. There will be a question, they'll say something and say, "Oh, that guy's really shady." Well, now I might think, "Oh, you're thinking about that guy? Well, he might be a little shady, but it might be a red herring as well." So they give me so much material to work with. It's just unbelievable sometimes.
Yeah, totally.
Well, now, we've talked quite a bit about that. If somebody's not familiar, could you kind of explain what is Delta Green?
Sure. So Delta Green is at this point is a standalone role-playing game, tabletop role-playing game, where you portray heroic people working in the federal government who are trying to fight supernatural evil. But because the nature of the evil is so corrosive and toxic to sanity and to soul and so forth, you also have to keep it a really, really deep secret. And the toll of that, of like being a hero fighting impossible odds while not being able to tell anyone about it, exacts a real price on you and your life. And part of the Delta Green role-playing game is that the deeper you go into all these mysteries and conspiracies and horror stuff going on, the more you suffer as a character, and your mental kind of resilience is broken down. And the way that you can kind of like stave off, collapse is to gradually, essentially like draw on the social bonds in your life, like your spouse, your friends, your church, whatever it is you've got. And over time, you may have these crisis moments where the only way you can kind of keep it together is if you cut yourself off from someone important to you. And by retreating from the world and becoming more isolated, you can kind of like protect yourself a bit and be less vulnerable and be able to carry on longer, but in a really damaged condition. And over time, your attachments to friends and family and your community and so forth just wither and kind of fall apart. And ultimately, you're going to die or go insane. But the trade-off, like the reason you do that is because you are, as they say, like raging against the dying of the light. Like you are heroically trying to make the world a better place, to stave off the apocalypse, to save just this life, this time, this day. For one day, I can make something better. And in return, I am going to suffer, but I'm willing to pay that price because that's the kind of heroism that the Delta Green is about. So it's very much a game of self-sacrifice. It's a game about trading your comfort and your security to make other people comfortable and more secure. It takes place in the modern day within the sort of the general Cthulhu mythos of H.P. Lovecraft, which we have adapted substantially into kind of a contemporary setting. Has a lot to do with like the military-industrial complex. You work for that, sort of the government or the military or somewhere in that nexus. But also many of your enemies come from the exact same organizations because they're trying to, in many cases, corruptly exploit the supernatural for their own gain or for power. But you also just deal with like random intrusions, just random, horrible, weird stuff that happens someplace, in the country or elsewhere you have to go deal with. So it's very much a horror game. It's a mystery game, and it's a very personal game that's about this kind of journey into self-sacrifice. And it's the opposite of a power fantasy. Most tabletop games, a lot of tabletop games traditionally have been power fantasies where you're kind of like getting stronger, you get more powers and, equipment and spells or, guns or hovercraft or whatever it is you need. And Delta Green, much like Call of Cthulhu, from whence it is inspired, is really more of a sacrifice fantasy of, like what can you do to make the world a better place, even if you pay the price.
Also, you have just released or recently had released The Labyrinth, with a source book for Delta Green. Is that correct?
Yeah. So when I got into video games 17 years ago now, I left tabletop games behind. I really needed a break. And I got back. I mean, I was kind of involved peripherally in Delta Green and Unknown Armies stuff over the years because those game lines continued on without me. But as the Delta Green role-playing game was coming out over the last couple of years from Arc Dream Entertainment, I was, involved in that process, just kind of, waving my hands benevolently from a distance, basically. But once it was out, I decided that I was ready to take on a new creative project in tabletop space. And so I wrote this new source book for Delta Green called The Labyrinth. And it was a chance to really create a bunch of organizations that exist in the world of Delta Green. And some of them are potential allies, like groups that can help you. And typically those are kind of mundane groups who are doing their mundane thing, but they can readily overlap with Delta Green's investigations and potentially help them. But the fact is that, as with the characters you play, when you're allies at some nonprofit, like one of the examples is the Center for the Missing Child, is one of the groups in the game that in the Labyrinth I created. And they're there as a resource for law enforcement and families who have missing or exploited children. They're real world organizations like this, of course. And you might turn to them because like they're helping out a family whose kid has gone missing, and they've been eaten by a shoggoth or something. But they don't know that, of course, and you may get entangled with them, and they might help you out and be like, "Hey, I'll give you a hand with this, research or whatever else it is," and that may be useful. And they may have access to important people or resources like a forensic examiner or something that you could use to help with. But as they kind of get more involved in your stuff, then they begin to degrade as well. And they begin to suffer the same kinds of costs that you're suffering. And so you're essentially pulling more people into your world where they will then, over time, begin to kind of sacrifice parts of themselves in the service of this mission you've drafted them into. And it's a way to kind of like to reinforce and bring home some of those themes of Delta Green. So besides the potential allied groups like that, there are also enemy groups that I created. These are all brand new organizations that are now in the world of Delta Green. And they're, some of them are kind of like Cthulhu cults of sorts. Some of them are very different kinds of organizations that have really different agendas. And they all present real huge challenges for the players to solve. With all these groups in the Labyrinth, I took on a new approach to designing factions in a tabletop game, which is that each faction, they have like their history, their resources, their agenda, their field operations, their NPCs that are significant characters for that group or whatever. But then they also have a kind of a 3-act structure of how they progress. So in the first act is kind of like when you first meet them and how they can get involved in your campaign, and how you get to know these people and what kind of stuff they can do and what they're up to. But then the next 2 stages of their progression shows how they begin to change because of their involvement with you and your activities. Whether they're an ally or an enemy, they don't stay the same. These are dynamic organizations with dynamic people, and those people will change. So if it's an enemy group, for example, like one of the enemy groups is, I wouldn't say they're innocuous, but they're like, not the most harmful thing in the world, but they're not great either. But when you begin to investigate them and poke at them and they realize like, oh crap, like these federal agents are sniffing around and causing this trouble, like they have to react to that. And so for each of these groups, I define like, okay, well, at stage 1, here's how they're operating. But if these conditions are met, where like Delta Green is investigating them and so forth, they're going to progress to stage 2. And stage 2, like they're going to escalate in response. They're going to make some big decisions and big changes about what they're doing and how they're doing it. and their threat level is going to go way up. And if you keep poking at the bear, you keep, messing with them, then we're going to escalate to stage 3. And in stage 3, it's like, oh, it's off the hook now. And now like things are really bad. And they have actually, because you have poked at them enough, they have sought and obtained even more power. They've become more powerful and more dangerous because you investigated them. And so the threat level just keeps rising and rising and rising as you poke at these things. And for the players, the challenge is like, how do we figure out how to how do we stop this? Basically, like we've spun this up and we've made things worse to some degree. So how do we make it better again? And I did this because it's very easy to define a group for a role playing game who just like they are what they are and they do what they do until you stop them. And once you like shoot the leader in the head or something, like ta-da, you won. And I really wanted to instead have groups that felt like they were living characters, that they would really dynamically respond to what happened and change in ways that are going to be surprising. So the players are like, they think they know what they're dealing with, and now it's like, what? And it's really going to take them by surprise. So that was my design goal in the Labyrinth, was to make these organizations feel more dynamic and more vital. So they can really, for a game master running a Delta Green campaign, they can bring in these allies and these enemies and really begin to make their campaign kind of a more responsive and dynamic experience and not just a series of adventures. At the same time, it's called a Labyrinth for a reason. These groups have connections to each other. And so in the book, for each one, I described how, well, if you begin to get involved with these guys, here are like 3 ways you can then have your players like discover something about this other group over here and get them involved. And now you can kind of like, head off in that direction. I also provided a section that runs down essentially like every Delta Green scenario in print and how you could connect that scenario to something in the Labyrinth. And my goal with this really is to, like, you might begin your campaign with some pre-written adventures you're running, but as you begin to pull in stuff from the Labyrinth, your players should begin to like build out agendas of their own. And if all goes well, as you introduce these groups into your campaign over time, you don't even need published adventures anymore because the players are driving what's going on. Like they're driving the investigations, they're pursuing different threads, different groups. They might be tangled up with 2 or 3 enemy groups at the same time and have 2 or 3 allied groups involved in different ways. And all this like ping-ponging back and forth, like that is the campaign at that point. And you don't even need to have a published adventure anymore because the players are just driving the car. And that's what I want to get game masters to, is the point where they can be comfortable with that level of autonomy. And the players, for them to kind of like gradually like walk into that role without even knowing it's happening.
Your whole take on the idea that the organizations change after certain conditions are met, I think is very fascinating, because you're absolutely right. Usually it's just a stat block or a couple paragraphs of information about an organization or a faction, and then there's nothing else, or a couple important NPCs and there's nothing else. So yeah. I think that is a really interesting take on that. I was going to also ask, since we've been going on quite kind of long here, where can people find you online and learn more about your work?
Great question. Well, I have a website, johntynes.com, which I've been running since 1995 when I published Puppetland way back in the day. And it's not, I wouldn't call it like exhaustive, but that's a decent place to start. I do have an account on Twitter that I use for professional stuff, to talk about games and game design and Delta Green and whatnot. So that's the other place, is to check that out on Twitter.
So I will provide a link to your website and to Twitter, as well as I will link up the Labyrinth, where people can buy that if they would like that on DriveThruRPG, all in the show notes for this episode at dicegeeks.com. So, John, I just want to thank you so much for being on the show today. It was an absolute pleasure.
Yeah, absolutely. I had a great time, Matt. Thank you.
Well, there you have it, guys. I really hope you enjoyed this conversation with John today. It was absolutely inspiring to me to hear him talk about his story and how he began self-publishing his own fanzine, and that led to his career in the tabletop RPG industry. And it just goes to show that if that is something that you are dreaming about, if you want to work on tabletop RPGs and you think it's just a fantasy, well, you can take a page from John's book, as it were, and start doing something. And you'll never know exactly where that is going to lead, but only good things happen when we put our best work out in the world. I have provided links to a lot of John's RPGs in the show notes for this episode at dicegeeks.com. There is also a link to the Delta Green sourcebook, The Labyrinth. It is now out in a hardcover book that you can pick up. I have links for that in the show notes as well, so you can check out this resource. Now, if you want something for free, head over to dicegeeks.com/free. You will get 10 free dungeon maps, plus you will never miss an episode of this show. And hey guys, if you enjoyed this interview with John Scott Tynes and my other interviews each and every week, then please consider supporting the show on Patreon. Just go to patreon.com/dicegeeks and consider supporting the show. It would mean the world to me. Now, I thank you for listening, and until next time, keep gaming.